Are you here? Then we do have a quorum and we could begin. I see Parashar is signed on by phone, maybe. So Jared and Laurie are not coming today. So I think this is it. So we should move along.
Please, who else is absent, or is that it?
So Laurie Hunter and Jared Stanton are not available today.
Right.
So everyone else is here. Reading from my participant list, Stephen Crane, Cynthia Rainey, Carl Packard, Carrie LaFleur, Terry Ackerman, Parashar Patel, and Elise Woodward. And Jeremy also, but I think Jeremy likes to exist in the shadows, even though we're dependent on him for setting us up. So thank you for joining on this beautiful February 17th. We do not have minutes today, so we will move our approval of minutes to the next meeting, which will be on March 3rd. Same time, same place. I heard today that many of us may be baby boomers, but actually we're all baby zoomers. Sorry, Stephen.
No, that's
Not a baby.
yeah. That sounds like a joke I'd make, Elise. That's not a compliment, but it does sound like a joke.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder there on that one. So, our discussion today. So first, I'll just say I'm very hopeful that we can solidify our recommendations today and vote on them, if at all possible. Understanding that we don't have the two school department representatives today. So we can discuss that a little bit later, whether we should wait to vote until they're with us. But I'm very interested in moving this forward. As Cynthia says, no reason to use all the runway. So I'd like to try to move our deliberations along and then determine what our deliverable will be to the select board and move forward with planning and writing that so that we can conclude the work of this task force. So today we said we would discuss the pros and cons of the capital planning standing committee. So I think I'll pull up if Stephen will give me screen sharing options. I'll pull up the list we had before.
You should be able to share. Please.
Maybe I can share it right away. Let's see here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so let's see if I can get this into our agenda. So these are the advantages of the standing committee that we had identified before, and I have a second slide for disadvantages. So I wanted to look at this, and this is by way of deciding whether we want to revisit this as an option or whether we will agree to stick with the enhance the current process option. So these are the advantages of a standing committee.
There it is.
And so I guess part of our conversation should include or should consider which of these items would we not be able to achieve with the enhanced process we've been discussing.
Well, it depends upon, what you mean by a focal. I mean, let's take these from the top. What you mean by a focal point? I mean, what we were talking about with the bear, that's what the bear enhanced process was that it would really be, the focal point would be a meeting of the school authorities and the town authorities. And I'm not sure whether that was including the select board in that meeting or not, but that was basically the breadth of that focal point, as opposed to a committee.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that all these entities, the school department and the town department, or the town manager's office or whatever, they've got a lot of other things on their plate, other charges. Of course, individuals always have other things on their plate too, but a capital planning committee, that would be, their thing. That would be what they would be charged with doing. That would be the only thing they were doing. That's one thing on.
Well, in the truth is that it is the town manager and the school department that have the authority and the responsibility for capital planning.
Just the same,
And
have the authority and the responsibility for coming up with the budgets, the operating budget.
yes, right. Well, I think that the enhanced plan that we had described included a meeting between the town manager and the superintendent of schools, an integrated plan for both the town and the schools, a presentation to the select board and school committee, a joint presentation to the select board and school committee, with representatives from the finance committee invited. Obviously, it would be a public meeting, so the finance committee could attend in total. And one of the elements that we should flesh out, I think, as a task force, is the specifics of citizen participation in that process. So obviously, the citizen participation would exist at that joint meeting of select board and school committee. But the question would be, would a hearing, so to speak, to the public, should we describe that as part of the process?
Well, usually with the hearing, there again, you don't really have a deliberation involving the citizens at a hearing. I mean, you hear the citizens, they get up to say what they want, but there's not a whole lot of dialogue back and forth in a hearing format. So, the other thing I was just thinking, over time, year after year after year, that there is this body that has this responsibility and the ability to monitor what's going on in the long term. I guess it goes back to one other thing that was part of our charge. I pulled that up somewhere. It was in there anyway. It was that we were supposed to provide some sort of explanation as to why the plan from 2002 wasn't followed through with. I'm trying to find it there in the charge.
Yep, that was in the charge. That was in the charge. Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that it wasn't followed through was that there was nobody who was really looking at it all the way through. I think that's a big advantage of having a standing committee, even if they only meet once a year, like the trustees of donations or something like that, but you can meet once a year, but if you have something that you really need to have a lot of meetings for, then the committee would have the ability to to enlarge their schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So Lisa, might I propose that we flip this and look at the enhanced process? and convince ourselves why that wouldn't be sufficient. That we would need a standing committee.
Yep, so this is the descriptors of the enhanced process. The annual joint meeting, the annual presentation to the select board and school committee, the template that Carrie and Terry developed, which would be a way of evaluating the sequencing of the projects. The project evaluation criteria, which we agreed needs some refinement on the language of those criteria.
Right. So if we back up, I like Cynthia's question. I think that's correct. If we back up one more slide, Elise, your question is, what is on this list as advantages that we can't do with our
I think there were
enhanced?
some other advantages that I mentioned that aren't in this list.
Right, and that's what I'm getting to. I think at the bottom, Carl, where it says ensuring that the process is followed. And the one right before it, reminding the public that we have this. I do agree with you, Carl, that if there's a body and that's their only charge, then for sure, those two last bullets there will get done. But all the bullets on the top, from focal point down to everyone would clearly understand, we could do all of those with the enhanced process if we have a really good process and it's really followed. But Carl's point, maybe it won't be really followed because there's not a committee that has this as their mission.
Yeah.
So let me
I
ask
think
this.
the bare bones enhanced, I call it the bare enhanced process. I think that's really a good improvement, having a template, having the coordination between the budgeting entities and the capital budgeting entities. But again, I think the thing that was lacking was a standing committee with citizens involved in it,
And the one other
and not
thing
just the
that's-
select board. Yeah.
And the one other thing that's lacking is if we go ahead a couple of slides. Back one slide. This slide, I think we should add a bullet about how the public hearing would work, that there should be a public hearing. And it should not just be like Carl said, that citizen one suggests this, and then we say, thank you very much. And then citizen two says something, then we say, thank you very much. It's got to be a discussion, a deliberation. There's got to be some way to discuss what the public is proposing.
So I was thinking something along the lines of, number one, the annual meeting. 2, out of that comes a presentation or an update of an existing capital plan, right? And then 3, public hearing for feedback. 4, a look at revising the plan based on the feedback.
Yeah.
Because I think if you just say, have a hearing and it has
Right.
no impact in terms of how you process the feedback, you have to have a loop so that citizens feel like it's worthwhile to turn out at the public hearing.
Right. I would just modify slightly what you just said. The first bullet I would put would be the template. That staff would probably develop the template to summarize what's being proposed or whatever.
Mhm.
And then we have the joint meeting where we talk about it all. And Okay, and then at the bottom, we have the citizen participation. And then how did you phrase that feedback? How are you?
I said to provide suggestions for modification, which is maybe a little vague.
Yeah. And then Cynthia, you said something about the town and school committees discuss it again or something?
Well, that number 2 bullet they need to meet again.
You mean the bottom, the fifth bullet?
Sorry, number 3. So they need to, somehow or another, feedback from the citizens needs to be incorporated into the plan. Maybe they don't, or maybe they do, but there has to be some commitment to hear people and do something with the feedback.
The difference between bullet number 2 and 3 right now. Yeah, something like this makes sense.
We are still talking about these should be 10-year plans, right?
Yeah. All right, so now the 4th bullet says annual presentation to joint meeting. That's
Annual presentation.
the 4th bullet. Maybe that wording's not right.
You've got, first you've got an annual joint meeting.
Right.
Yeah, what's the,
Okay, so this bullet number 2 is the joint meeting of the town and school administrations.
oh, yeah.
So
Oh,
they're going to put forward a proposal. Then you're going to have a hearing to solicit citizen participation. And then you're going to have an annual presentation or an annual meeting of a joint meeting of the select board, school committee, plus FinCom representatives to review the 10-year plan and incorporate citizen suggestions or not,
mhm.
prioritize the projects,
Okay.
the timing, and the debt sequencing.
Okay, then I didn't understand. I think bullet number 1 and 2 need to be reversed. First, the town and school administrations meet. Then we can develop the template.
The template would be developed after that integrated plan.
Yeah. Then we post that plan on the website or something, and citizens can provide suggestions. And then finally, we have this big joint meeting. Yeah. Stephen, what do you think about that? Where the first bullet is basically it's you and Lori meeting.
Excuse me. I think it's a chicken or egg on the template versus the meeting. At some point in
Okay.
time, we'll have to create a template, and when we meet, maybe the first year, we'll create the first time we do this. If this is the recommendation that gets adopted, and we have this enhanced planning process, I would say the first go of it, we would develop the template, but then in future years, we would plug the projects into the template, which is because I'm looking at our charge right now, and it's determined specifically what constitutes very large, develop a template, and then determine the process for evaluation, timing, and prioritization of projects. And that's a balancing priorities of different stakeholders and balancing service demand with affordability. Which is one of the things I was kind of stuck on. Where the template thing goes, I think is not, like I said, it's fine for the development of the process. It'll probably switch in future years. I think it's more, and I'm gonna maybe make too fine of a point on this, but should we be saying, to tie back to our charge, should we be saying stakeholder participation instead of citizen participation?
How about both? I think we need both.
Well, stakeholders are citizens, are they not?
Yeah,
Well, I'm thinking about people who might not be particularly gung ho on recreation or schools or anything else, but they're still taxpayers and they want to see the whole plan and know if it's affordable. But I agree with Stephen. I think number 2, template to summarize and update, change the word present to update. Because that's what we'll be doing most years. We'll be just taking last year's and updating it.
I don't know if the project evaluation criteria should go with the meeting of the town and school administrations, or if it should go with the template. Yeah, because fundamentally, when the project is identified, it should be filtered through the project evaluation criteria.
Yeah. So maybe
well, it goes into the first
So you
bullet.
got it right
it
there.
goes in the first bullet.
Uh, I don't know, I think, linking it with the template kind of made sense, but whatever.
Oh, you'd like it better with the template?
That's where you had it, yeah.
Carl, what about in the first bullet where it says prioritize tier 3 projects? Prioritize tier 3 projects according to the project evaluation criteria.
Yeah.
So I don't see the criteria as prioritizing a project.
Yeah.
I see the
yeah, I
projects
think-
being prioritized based on needs assessment, but
Okay.
every
Yeah.
project being evaluated with the criteria to be certain that it has its
You can check off, sir.
resiliency pieces
We've
in
looked
it.
at this, yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm going to move it back.
This is Prasher. I'm kind of curious. I missed the opening part, so I apologize. But do we have to get so granular as to start sort of mentioning the template and stuff in here? Because I understand at some point they're going to want a standardized report or whatever. But should we take a bigger picture perspective and just say, look, in the first bullet, when you do all this, you're going to present and discuss the projects, including how they meet the project evaluation criteria, and then go to the current bullet 3 and 4.
Yeah, I'm a little intent on being granular, Parashar, because I want to be sure that we've talked about all this. We may not really need it.
I think, we're supposed to recommend a process, and this is a process. I think, again, we're making a recommendation. It's like, those things.
So I have project evaluation criteria in 2 places now, so we can think about it and decide. Maybe it is its own little event that you have the annual meeting, and then the projects are prioritized, and then the prioritized projects are filtered with the project evaluation criteria, and then put into the template.
I think everything you're attaching to the template development is right. I just think, and I know you keep moving it back and forth, but ultimately, I think if we went this way, the superintendent and the town manager would jointly agree on the prioritization of projects and fill out the template and then present that template to the joint meeting.
Yeah, okay.
Correct.
It's just going to make another point. It's quite likely that many of these projects will be on the plan for 10 years. And that the template and the evaluation criteria would be looked at each year over that time as the project, comes up to the front of the line or whatever. So, I think those things, the template would, the content might change, and the standing in the evaluation criteria may change for an individual project over time till it gets to the front of the line and gets its shot.
Mhm.
Bullets number 1 and 2 could even be combined if you wanted to, or they can be kept separate like this. And the only thing that I think is missing now is what we talked about last time, the time frame. We talked about 2 different time frames, one being part of the budget cycle. And then I think we decided instead it should be done, maybe finished by September or something. So if we still want to do that, I think we should put some dates, like annual joint meeting each summer, or some, put some general timeframes in there.
Or after, after town meeting, which could be May.
Same
We
thing.
get back to our old schedule.
Sure. And none of the timeframes matter except for the last one. The last one, the annual presentation, should take place by some certain date so that people can then develop budgets. And so once people see that bullet has a timeframe, they can go backwards and schedule when the template has to be posted on the website and all that other stuff. But when do we want that last bullet to be done, the annual presentation? Do we want that in September, or what do we want?
Do we want to be general to maybe say something to permit sufficient time for the town and the schools to develop proposals and other, I'm making up words here, in essence, to be able to make sure the steps that are necessary to bring anything to the subsequent town meeting are all in place. So you've got a bit of runway, right? If anything has to happen, you need to provide that runway.
So do we want this annual presentation to be made during the guideline process or before the guideline process?
Well, maybe ask a question to Stephen.
I was going to say that
Stephen,
in the guideline
for-
process,
All right, hold on a second.
projects that are at the head of the line.
And Parashar, you were in the middle of a thought.
well, I was going to ask Stephen a question because I think for these very large projects, to the extent that they need warrants or borrowing authority or whatever, that would probably occur outside the guideline process. And so the question I was going to ask Stephen is, how much typical, I know there's no typical, so forgive me, but like, is it sufficient to say, you know what, if we need to put something on the town warrant, or, take the school construction project as an example, we need 7 months or 8 months runway to be able to get that done. And whatever that time is, maybe we just work backwards from the calendar at least and say sufficient. And that's what I was getting to with the general sufficient time and permit development of town warrant, et cetera. Make it general, because if you run into situations like we did with COVID and you have to adjust the town meeting, you don't want to be held to fixed months on the calendar like we currently have been, and then have to scramble to adjust those.
Well, that's why I was proposing after the town meeting, whenever that occurs.
So, I mean, theoretically, that's right. But practically and politically, that's just not how tier 3 type projects play out. They play out, with feasibility studies. They have their own friends of type groups that support them either through the appointment of a project-based committee or through just an interest group, the group that helped form now the BD Center was a little different because it wasn't debt exclusion, but say you had a group that formed that wanted something like that via debt exclusion. And so basically, the key here is our role is to make sure that we evaluate time and prioritize the projects, balancing priorities of different stakeholders and balancing service demands with affordability. What you're talking about, Prashar, is, almost like advocacy or championing of the projects. And in some ways, our prioritization is our championing of it, but then you wouldn't see either the superintendent or the town manager necessarily lobbying. There would be community education, but that runway would be used by others who support the project.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I didn't mean to imply lobbying. I just, at some point, you've got to get the paperwork in order and all that kind of stuff to get things into the town warrant if necessary. That's what I meant by one way. That's what I meant, not lobbying or anything.
Yeah, but even that, there's, like you said, it's outside the guidelines, but would the advocates or the town man, whether it's the town manager or the school committee or school superintendent, would they go to the finance committee to talk about the project as a courtesy, even if the finance committee wasn't, their only vote was on the recommendation of the warrant article? Yeah, that's happening now at the middle school.
So I think we're getting off topic. So, Parashar, what I envision is something like, okay, we slot a project, this group slots a project for FY24, right? That's like, if that happens, let's say next summer or something, that means that project is going to happen, right? It's in fact, that would
It's
be
not long-range planning.
So, and I doubt we're going to slip a big, huge project in before we get a shovel in the ground on the middle school, but I could be wrong. But that's up to this process, right?
Right.
So I don't honestly think there's going to be a very large project very, very soon, but I could be wrong.
No, so,
Also,
yeah, no,
I think I'm not sure if you were here at last meeting, Parashar. We talked about two different time frames. One was that this whole process takes place 3-4 months before town meeting, like February, March, January, February, March, whatever. And then we decided that's not a long enough runway, that we needed this process to be pretty much finished every year before budgets began to be developed. Like it's totally separate from the tier 1 and 2 capital plan. And I'm not sure if you were here, Parashar, for that discussion.
I was.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I agree with Cynthia after town meeting, but I think that's too vague because being on the select board 2 years now, sometimes we've interpreted after town meeting to be let's start in September. I don't think that's going to work. I think we need to firm it up a little bit more than that. Maybe it has to be completed by Thanksgiving or whatever it is. I think we need to have a real deadline in there. Otherwise, the budget won't be able to contain the debt service for the project. There won't be good enough runway, good enough planning.
So what about tying it to the fiscal year? Maybe 30 days after the end of the fiscal year or at the end of the fiscal year, by then the report is due or something, right?
Something like that. That's correct.
Because it almost seems as if timing may not matter because the projects are going to be so big. To
Right.
Stephen's point, there's going to be a lot of work happening anyway. And there won't be an immediate need at the next town meeting, perhaps, for something. Hopefully not.
Right. Yeah, let's tie it to the fiscal year. I agree with that.
So Carrie and Stephen, I'd like to have your point of view on that.
yeah, if we're treating them separate from the regular capital planning process and they're kind of, the discussion and reporting and prioritization are outside like the normal annual one, then as far as I'm concerned, it can be anytime.
Okay,
I quite frankly think, when do you get your biggest bang for your buck in terms of audience is probably if you folded it somewhere into the annual town meeting process or,
Right.
you know, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case.
well, I'd like to wonder with you all about whether it needs to be a firm annual schedule. I mean, if there is an annual meeting, a joint meeting in a normal year, fine. But it's possible that there could be a year when the town and school administrations might have to have a point of view about more than one project. And so that timing might happen, on a different schedule. So if we use the Giroux land as an example, that came up opportunistically, right? So wouldn't maybe easily fit into an annual schedule.
Hmm.
In fact, probably every land acquisition project would be on an opportunistic schedule.
So my one thought is getting this off the ground the first year will probably be more time consuming than subsequent years,
Okay,
right?
Sure.
I agree with that.
And I will say
And-
that I would like to do this this year starting, if we're going to start this year, this would obviously be July.
Mhm.
Just because of when town meeting is.
I
So-
agree, Cynthia, and at least you raised a good point about the exception, so maybe we should consider, if we're gonna have an annual process, do we consider building in an exception so that when there are opportunistic things, you go through almost a compressed schedule, make sure you're using the template and the evaluation criteria, et cetera, and present it to the joint committees of relevance, et cetera.
well, I think yes, because it seems to me that while we might anticipate one annual joint meeting, in fact, some years maybe there would be two.
Yeah.
So if we said an annual joint meeting of town and school administrations, to review the 10-year plan, this is to start it off. It would be in the summer,
Mhm.
annual August joint meeting.
I'm curious, Stephen, does it matter from your perspective, balancing work before end of start of fiscal year, or is it one half dozen of the other?
I think you'd probably be better off having it sometime in June.
Okay,
Yeah, if we return to normal cadence, I should say if, typically the school committee and the superintendent are somewhat dormant in August.
Okay,
I'm told so is the rest of the town.
Take her vacation.
Right, yeah, pretty much.
So I think we should just, perhaps as part of the annual process, set the calendar as appropriate.
Yeah, I think we can let the superintendent and the town manager schedule the first bullet around their own schedule and their vacations and everything. But the important part is that last bullet, that annual presentation should take place, no later than whatever, September or whatever we want to say. Yeah, like that, for example. And then they can work backwards and they can schedule the other 3 items how it fits. And then we can have a policy for exceptions. I think that's a good idea.
well, I think the policy for exceptions would be to run the process on a different timetable.
I mean, maybe we just put in another bullet saying, if an opportunistic project comes in off cycle, then a condensed schedule will be done, or something like that. Maybe we don't have to spell out all these details about how the condensed schedule is going to work.
Just a note on the opportunistic land purchases. I mean, I don't think that we've had an opportunistic land purchase of more than $5 million in the recent past. So while some of, with Giroux, it turned into a project that would meet these qualifications. The land purchase piece of it would have potentially been outside of this process.
Right. And I think that's what caused a lot of the confusion and complaints from citizens. That exactly what Carrie is saying, that what they thought was a $1 or $2 million land purchase then suddenly became a phased project with worth $5 or $6 million. I think that created a lot of rumbling out there.
But I guess I would be concerned with a very large opportunistic project then. If Giroux, even though it was opportunistic, we had a lot of time to work within the land purchase. And I think people would be equally upset with taking a $10 million opportunistic project off cycle and cramming it into a short period of time. So I don't know how much time we need to spend figuring out how do we push opportunities through the process, because
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll just take this out. It's like TMI and unnecessary.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, this process is advisory anyway.
Right.
Advisory to select board, advisory to town manager, advisory to town meeting, depending on advisory to school committee, depending on who's championing the project. To me, it's making sure that the community is clear on what the priorities are, what the decisions were based on, and did we give them a chance to offer input on it? And that's what I think the overall goals were based on my reading of the charge and the feedback that we started this process off with.
But would the select board have the opportunity to codify this if they so desired?
Yeah, I mean, the select board has the authority to not put it on the warrant.
No. The process to codify it into an AP or whatever they're called.
APP.
Yeah, I suppose they could do that.
Mm-hmm. Because I'd like it to be, from our charge, I know at the very end of the day, it's town meeting that decides these, makes the big decisions here. But I think on the other hand, we had a pretty strong charge to provide some kind of structure beyond just suggesting.
Or determine the process.
Mhm.
Right, but if it's just, to me, it's just, these are some suggestions versus this is how we are going to do things as a town going
I
forward.
think we thought things through pretty well, but again, the entities that are carrying out the process may find things that don't work, or may find things that work better.
Yeah.
But I think we've been pretty thorough.
Well, I think I hear what Cynthia's saying. Put in that word advisory on the top.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it does say the purpose of the Concord capital planning team is to develop a process for townwide capital planning. This process will then be used annually to develop a 10-year capital plan, including all foreseeable town and Concord public school capital projects. But I think the charter doesn't say that. So I think that's where I think with the charge was give us the structure. Because wasn't this committee appointed by the select board?
Yeah.
Right. So I think Cynthia's point is, this should be developed in a way that it's going to be predictable every year, as opposed to being optional.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the idea, Cynthia, that we should turn over a process that is turnkey, that can be accepted as the process to go forward.
But I think this needs to be written down somewhere that is a reference document. Besides our presentation, you know what I'm saying?
But, you know, it'll be a report from the committee, and the report will largely be,
No, beyond that, like the financial practices document that Mr. Harris put together. That's not the charter, but that's how the finance department of the town operates, correct?
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think those financial practices are the protocol, essentially, that's followed. I think that's why that was written.
They are, but boy, there's a lot of opinions about them and who should have adopted them. So you know, there's a lot of disagreement, I guess, about things.
I'm wondering if this is a question for town council, a quick one. I mean, this is not something you want to put in the bylaws, but if you want a little bit of a process that's formalized, you know, what can make it more formal than putting it into SOPs, I guess, is a question, if we're not convinced the SOPs are a right way to go.
I think that that's a question really for, this is a deliverable to the select board. And I think that we should deliver a draft policy, and then it would be the select board's, you know, I think, and Tara, you can stop me if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that it would be a draft, quote unquote, but I think like I said, a turnkey ready draft policy, APP, whatever it is. And then the select board has the choice to say, yeah, we're going to do this, or no, we want to do it a little differently.
Right, I think that's correct, but I think at that point, the select board, I think we should at that point have this discussion about, should it be formalized in an APP? Should it be in the town financial practices, or what should we do? Let's maybe talk to town council and find out how to make this and the charter both work together, and, you know, so, yeah, I agree.
Okay, so this task force can have a recommendation of of making this a formal process somehow, and
Right.
leave it to the select board to decide how
Right.
they want to implement that.
And I think we should make some formal recommendation, because to Carl's point, if it's not spelled out really well, it can kind of go the same way as that 2002 report where nothing happens.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's fair to say that nothing happened with that
Well, sorry.
2002 report.
Yeah.
So I think we should, perhaps we need to look at that again and try to answer that question about why that may have been, why the recommendations may have been too cumbersome to implement, or were they simply inconvenient to implement? So I think we should.
The story I've heard is that the opportunistic projects came in and superseded.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
But I agree with Elise. We should probably take a really good look and see if that story is correct or what.
So I think it's
Not an opportunistic project from nowhere. It was an opportunistic reshuffling of the.
Correct.
Well, opportunistic projects don't really come from nowhere. They come from, you know, they're out there for a long time before they surface.
Correct. They were on the list, but in a different order.
Exactly.
So in other words, somebody did a template and looked through evaluation criteria and everything. And then some stakeholders came in and politically convinced the town to reorder it. Now, so
And the fiscal evaluation of the tax impacts and so on had been, thought through for that 2002 plan, and then it was,
Right.
shifted around.
So the truth is that every one of these plans is talked about and looked at as if it is a static plan that we will follow no matter what. And it is all of the opportunistic aspects of life that take it off track. Because unless an entity has adequate funds to actually support the funding of that plan, and then add opportunistic projects, it can't possibly be maintained. And I think if you looked at the TBA plan, the draft for that's currently in process, same thing. Great recommendations about how that plan will be taken up in, but in fact, the reality will be really different. It's true with the transportation implementation plan of the state. How long has the Route 2 Rotary been on the tip? 20 years, 30 years. Guess what? It's going to cost more money than they originally thought.
Just spent a bunch of money on it, which means it's going to be 5 years out further than it was before they put down pavement.
Exactly.
So I mean, at least and I don't. This is going to come across as terribly cynical, but I think I was trying to find the 2002 report because I know I did look at it, and I actually thought a number of the things were implemented or at least charted pretty accurately. But it's like the title of this recommendation could be, here's what we think could be a clear and consistent process for tier 3 projects, and then you have an asterisk, and then down below you say, except for shifting political concerns, financial situations, and opportunistic needs.
I know.
And any other thing that may come up over the next 10 years. Like, we can either ignore the history that has happened here and in every other town, where politics and shifting winds sometimes change approaches and change priorities, and just play it straight and say this is a pragmatic and objective way to evaluate and prioritize tier 3 projects, or we can have the process be something that is flexible enough that acknowledges that there's going to be politics and shifting priorities, and says, oh, by the way, this can be modified to even accommodate for those types of things. It's two different philosophical approaches to whatever the final, it is going to be. I honestly don't really know what the right approach is, but I do know that they're two very different things.
But isn't that the purpose of the annual update? The way I see the annual update is that you have your original template. Now you get to the next year, things have changed. You want to reprioritize. Okay, great. But you still are going to make a new template that's going to be fiscally sound, which is different from, I think, what happened before. And then the third year it changes again. Okay, fine. And then maybe the fourth year it stays the same as the third year, whatever. But each year the fiscal part is also looked at along with the political part so that we can afford to do all these projects.
And I think the important thing is that you're looking at the long range fiscal picture every time. Every time an opportunistic project comes up, or even as these things are already on the plan, you're looking at it in that context of the long range fiscal plan.
Good. So what do you think? Can we support this as our recommendation, as the core of our recommendation?
Well,
Would you like to think about it for 2 weeks and bring it up again when Laurie and Jared are here?
It might be, yeah, because there's only a few of us here and
Well, sorry,
Go ahead.
I'm not going to speak for Lori and Jared, but I do know that, I mean, obviously I think Lori has communicated about her support for the enhanced town school project. The only other thing, and I've mentioned this before, the only other consideration is, in Vision Concord, the long range plan, under the public facilities and infrastructure section had goal number 8, which was assess the responsibility for staffing 66 plus town boards, committees, commissions, and task forces from a limited pool of residents who are willing to serve as volunteers. And it goes on to talk about basically maybe look at some, they call it streamlining. I think that's code for maybe reducing the number of committees. And some committees can be formed and operate with very little staff interaction and support. A capital planning task force is going to need an intense amount of town staff time and support.
well, isn't
And
it
I
stuff
think-
that's supposed to be done or going to be done anyway?
But it's still, there's still packets and agendas and oh, I didn't see this piece of information. Believe me, Carl, I've been through this with the capital planning committee. And I just think that what we're trying to look at, which is the prioritization and the sequencing, which was like really the focal point of the charge, I don't know that a standalone committee gets you that, which is why I think that that's why I gravitate towards the enhanced process, because that's really where you're able to have those prioritization conversations and really bring the prominent stakeholders and citizenry into it versus a group of, a individual task force just to general capital. And the other thing is, how often are they going to meet? If there's not, if tier 3 projects come along, few and far between, you're going to have this committee that doesn't meet, but maybe once or twice a year tops.
Right, yeah.
Whereas the school committee, select board, like they're going to be engaged in this on an ongoing basis.
So Stephen, those considerations are represented in this disadvantage list for the standing committee, as we discussed before.
The
Okay.
where the fact of not having
Well,
looking at that, because I have the old, I don't know, this is a month old, but
well, I think it's the same.
The
I don't think
disadvantages.
we modified this. This is the slide
Yeah.
that captured the disadvantages that this task force had collected about a standing committee. The duplication, the difficulty of recruiting citizen volunteers, an additional layer of planning and
of course,
approval.
a committee that meets only once a year, that's
Yeah.
I would join it.
And so,
I want to be sure that if we go with the enhanced process, that we address as much as possible the two concerns that Carl raised. One is that the capital planning committee would have as its focus to do this and only this, and would make sure it gets done and explained to the public. That we can have as strong a process as possible so we can get as much of that done. And the other thing that he and Elise addressed was to make sure that the public hearing have a way for deliberation, not just suggestions. So if we can find a way to make this strong enough to address concerns, then I think it would have the advantages of both the committee and the enhanced system.
Find that difficult in the context. I'll tell you, I don't want to be filibustering or anything like that, but I would like at least two more weeks to just kind of, because I think that the idea of the standing committee, I'm not willing to give it up that easily. But I do want to be, I don't want to be filibustering.
Okay.
One thing I think I'll just add, I know, Stephen, you said once a year, twice a year. I don't know that we could limit the standing committee to be meeting once or twice a year, to be honest with you. I mean, just the way folks have a tendency to ask for information, want to dive deep into this, et cetera. I think you'd end up getting more than meeting once or twice a year, but that's just my.
Well, if there's nothing to talk about, there wouldn't be, but anyway. I would just,
Okay.
you know, to give it,
Okay, so I think it is fair enough that we should consider our conversation for an additional 2 weeks, and we'll take up the recommendations and the vote in 2 weeks.
At least why don't we try to, I think, I'm just looking at it's actually 2003 report. And I think it does, bear perhaps a short discussion before we close in our final recommendation.
Okay,
Um,
so would you propose that we have that today or in 2 weeks to give
Well, I
people a
think
chance to look at
I
it?
personally hadn't looked at this report in quite some time.
All right, so that will be the homework.
Yeah.
To have a look at the 2002, 2003 report and its recommendations, and to come back with thoughts for discussion about what was implemented from that and what may not have been implemented and why.
Is this the 2003 Facilities Planning Committee report?
It
Yeah.
is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So from our agenda, I think we have talked about all of the items except the case study. We've not refined the criteria and the case study.
I think you really need to do the case study once we've settled on how we're gonna recommend.
Yeah.
And then you would run the case study through the whatever process we
Yeah.
select, right?
Right. So we had talked about whether the middle school would be a candidate for the case study, or Juro land, or the high school,
with
or
this,
something
this
else.
would be, I mean, a case study like, in business school or whatever, it's usually you're looking at something, an historic.
Historic, exactly right. Historic case study. So I'm not personally in favor of using the middle school as a case
More the high
study.
school probably would be, I mean, at least
The
that's.
high school would be a better choice
Yeah.
because it is, it's completed.
We almost need both the high school and the Giro. One's large, one's small, one's multi-phased. So
Yeah, but is Juro more than 5 million?
Yes, if you're adding in the land purchase and the development.
Okay,
But it was also a opportunistic purchase, right? And so in that perspective, you've got one that's planned and people knew ahead of time, the high school. And then here's how an opportunistic purchase like Juro could potentially work in this process.
Is Juro being funded with excluded debt?
No,
No, it's debt within the levy. Carrie, does that include the dredging?
no, I mean, without the dredging,
Okay, it's still 5. Oh, that's higher than I thought it was.
okay. All right, so so the high school and the Juro will be our working examples for case study, and we'll consider running them through this process. After we have firmed up the process that we're going to recommend. What additional information do we want to collect prior to writing our report?
Well, I think maybe we want to talk about the format of the report. Like, I think we talked briefly about it, and it's going to be, I thought, pretty brief, and then have a bunch of appendices.
Right.
So it might be possible, since you want to get moving forward, and it is almost March, and that would be great to get this done. that maybe we start thinking about how to divide up the appendices, so each of us can collect documents and all that.
So once upon a time, we had an outline for a report, so I could resurrect that and send it around and then use it as a stalking horse for everyone to modify, adjust, etc.
I mean,
We really
basically,
can begin that process, right?
I beg your pardon?
yeah,
We can begin. assembling
Bernie,
a
like,
report.
done a lot of the work for the appendices, I think, when, in order to do our public input session and create the slides. And I think the stuff is just all over the place now. And if each person collects some of it, I think we could put it together pretty quickly.
Okay, so I'll send the report outline. And next meeting, we'll discuss it and we'll discuss responsibilities for the various segments of the report. So we can move forward on it. And the appendices.
Sounds good.
Okay.
The only thing I would ask is, and Carl, this is more for you. Like I said, one of the reasons why I obviously came to a preferred conclusion relatively quickly was because I looked at the charge and I looked at what problem are we trying to solve. I think the committee versus no committee is like choosing no committee over a committee doesn't necessarily reduce the number of meetings that will be required as a part of this process. I was really focused on how do we solve the issues that have been identified in our charge. And I just, like I said, I look as how does a committee solve it versus how does the enhanced process solve it? And I guess I'd just say that helped clarify it for me. And so I just throw that out there as food for thought.
Thank you. Other reflections? I don't see any member of the public who might want to make a comment here.
In that case, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Yay.
Okay,
Second,
all right. We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you all.
Have a good evening.
See you in 2
Thank
weeks.
you, Elise.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Bye.
bye now.